In this world, paranormal events occur all the time, but they have become far less common in modern society. This is likely due to societal progress, which has significantly reduced the number of people dying with unresolved grievances. The story I'm about to share with you is a haunting incident that happened many years ago. Due to the societal and cultural norms of that era, this tragic event unfolded, leaving behind a lingering spirit bound by resentment. It wasn't until years later, through an unexpected turn of events, that the spirit found release. The story is a bit lengthy, so I'll narrate it in the first person to make it easier for you to follow. It was 2006, and I had decided to take a much-needed break from my routine. During this trip, by sheer chance, I unwittingly resolved an unresolved grievance that had persisted for years. Back then, I was feeling a bit disenchanted with life. Maybe disenchanted isn't the right word, perhaps restless or eager to escape fits better. I took about a month to wander through the American Southwest, exploring places like Sedona, Flagstaff, and Santa Fe. The journey, with its unhurried pace, brought me a sense of peace and joy. One of my stops was in a quaint historic town near Sedona, Arizona. Unlike more tourist-heavy spots, this place had a serene charm that captivated me. The winding streets, local performances, and the quiet, almost spiritual atmosphere drew me in. I spent 5 blissful days there, starting my mornings with coffee in the town square, enjoying the sunny afternoons by the riverbank, and retreating to my lodge to listen to the rain at night. But on my last evening, while dining at a local restaurant, I overheard a conversation at the next table. They were sharing a ghost story, a tale so intriguing that I couldn't sit still. After some deliberation, I decided to investigate it myself. The story centered around an incident in a remote area near Mount Eldon, a popular hiking destination not far from Flagstaff. The mountain, known for its serene trails and natural beauty, had become a tourist hotspot. Yet, the story I heard seemed too peculiar to ignore. A woman at the neighboring table recounted that her niece and her niece's husband ran a cozy mountain inn for hikers who couldn't find accommodation in the main town. Their business was doing well, but something eerie had happened recently. A local farmer, who often supplied them with fresh produce, had suddenly gone mad. The farmer's family had locked him in the house for his safety, and rumors about the incident began to spread. The farmer lived in a small, historic neighborhood at the edge of the town. The area was famous for its cobblestone streets, lined with old oak trees. At the far end of the street was an ancient well that had been the main water source for the community long before modern plumbing. Strangely, it was after drawing water from this well that the farmer's behavior changed. Witnesses claimed that after pulling up a bucket of water, the farmer dropped everything and fled home in terror. Not long after, he descended into madness. The townsfolk began speculating about the well. Some claimed the water turned blood red. Others spoke of a mysterious water spirit said to cause hallucinations or madness if consumed. The rumors grew wilder, and eventually, someone sealed the well with wooden planks. As I listened, I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be a rational explanation for these events, or perhaps something more sinister. Either way, I knew I had to see it for myself. The following morning, I packed up and left the lodge, determined to uncover the truth. After a bus ride to Flagstaff and a series of lifts from friendly locals, I reached the small town near Mount Eldon. The place had only one modest inn, and my arrival felt out of place in such a secluded, tight-knit community. That evening, I wandered through the town, trying to strike up conversations with locals. My goal was to learn more about the farmer's strange behavior. Eventually, I found myself at the end of the cobblestone street where the ancient well stood. Nearby, I noticed two peculiar structures, a weathered plaque covered in inscriptions and an old wooden archway about 100 feet from the well. It was late, and the dim light made it hard to read the plaque. I decided to return to my inn, planning to revisit the area the next morning. Before leaving, I approached a group of elderly men smoking pipes and chatting nearby. Casually, I steered the conversation toward the farmer. They seemed reluctant to share details, perhaps wary of an outsider like me. What they did tell me was intriguing. The farmer's family had once been prominent in the area. Their ancestral home included the land where the well, plaque, and archway stood. Over the years, the family's fortunes declined, and they sold off most of the property. The farmer now lived in a small house next to the well, relying on selling produce to the mountain inns for a living. The elders didn't elaborate much on the rumors, and sensing their hesitation, I decided not to push further. Instead, I planned to visit the farmer's house the next day to see if I could learn more directly from his family. I leaned forward, crouched down, and greeted the elderly lady. Introducing myself, I explained that I wanted to ask her some questions. I told her that this was my line of work and that I was here to help. Despite my efforts, she simply stared at me, her expression cold and silent. As I wondered how to gain her trust, a woman in her 40s, carrying a grocery basket, approached us. Her sharp gaze swept over me as she cautiously asked who I was and why I was there. Guessing she might be the homeowner, possibly the farmer's wife or sister, I truthfully explained my purpose. I told her I was a tourist from Chicago, and during my travels I'd stumbled upon this unusual story. I offered to help resolve the problem without charging any fees, explaining that it was more out of professional habit than anything else. I reassured her that I had no ulterior motives. If I were in it for money, I joked, it would be far too risky. I'd be too nervous to handle it properly. After much persuasion, she reluctantly agreed, likely reasoning that I was either some eccentric problem solver or just a curious bystander looking for excitement. Once inside, she handed me a glass of water. Though I couldn't help but wonder if it came from the well nearby, I didn't dwell on it. I asked to see the farmer directly, but she refused, suggesting I direct all my questions to her instead. Through our conversation, I learned that the farmer wasn't exactly mad, just deeply shaken by something he'd seen. She recounted the incident. Her husband had gone to the well to fetch water that day. After lowering the bucket and drawing it back up, he began skimming off the moss and debris floating on the surface. But instead of moss, he pulled out a clump of tangled hair. Curious and alarmed, he peered into the well. At the bottom, he saw a woman dressed in white, her long hair draped over her face, her pale complexion eerily blank as she stared up at him unblinking. Terrified, he abandoned the bucket and bolted home, babbling incoherently about what he had seen. His wife said she could barely make sense of his words until later that evening, when he calmed down enough to explain. By then, he was visibly traumatized, his mind clouded by fear. As she spoke, I couldn't help but recall a scene from a Japanese horror film where a vengeful spirit crawls out of a well, then out of a TV screen. Japanese folklore often weaves intricate ghost stories with spirits born of intense emotions or collective beliefs. While the comparison was vivid, I reminded myself to stay grounded in reality. The woman continued, explaining how that night, as her husband's strange behavior began to worry her, an even more unsettling event occurred. The dogs in their small town, all of them, gathered outside their home, barking furiously at the well. Their relentless howls lasted until dawn. This eerie phenomenon fueled local rumors, isolating the farmer's family from the rest of the community. The woman admitted she had her doubts about her husband's story. She had checked the well herself, finding only clear water and no sign of the ghostly figure. The sheriff's office dismissed the rumors, even covering the well with a wooden lid, reducing the incident to local gossip. Still, I felt there was more to the story. From my experience, wells often had commemorative markers, usually to honor those who had built them. The farmer's account, despite his fragile state, might hold some truth. And the dogs? Their reaction suggested something unusual was indeed at play. In many cultures, dogs are believed to sense the supernatural. Their barking, aggressive yet fearful, might indicate the presence of a ghost. In such cases, traditional remedies like hanging a mirror opposite the front door or scattering ash could be used to ward off spirits. As the woman finished her story, the elderly lady from earlier entered the room. Her voice, sharp and commanding, contrasted with her frail appearance, exuding wisdom. She had clearly overheard our conversation and decided to share her perspective. At 86 years old, she was the oldest resident in the area and the grandmother of the farmer. As she began to speak, Pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and the story's true depth became clear. She said that over 60 years ago, back when she was a young lady in her family, her household upheld strict traditions similar to those of old-fashioned aristocratic families. Her father had 6 wives, and she was the daughter of the second wife. By the time her father married his sixth wife, he was already over 60 years old, while the sixth wife was just in her early 20s. Being favored yet unable to bear children due to her husband's advanced age, she also found no happiness as a woman. Outcast by the other wives, she began an affair with a rogue from the outside world, which resulted in her becoming pregnant. When the affair was discovered, the punishment, according to the family's rules, was to bury her alive. She was first locked in a dark room, forced to kneel, and flogged repeatedly. The physical and emotional abuse led to the loss of her unborn child. Eventually, she managed to escape, only to find that the rogue had taken her father's money and fled far away. Devastated and filled with despair, she threw herself into a well. Her body was quickly recovered, and to preserve his reputation, her father spread a lie, claiming that the sixth wife had died of depression due to her inability to have children. To further the pretense, he erected a memorial arch in her honor and gave her a lavish burial. I interrupted the elderly woman recounting this story and asked how long ago it had happened. She thought for a moment and replied, 66 years ago. I then asked how old the sixth wife had been at the time of her death. The elderly woman said, 22 years old. Doing some quick mental calculations, I asked if anyone from the other wives' descendants had died 22 or 48 years ago. She nodded and said, 48 years ago, the eldest wife's son died, and 22 years ago, the fourth wife also died unexpectedly in a house. At that point, I was certain this was a case of haunting, and not just any haunting, but a vengeful spirit. Vengeful spirits, fueled by their unrelenting hatred, are rare and dangerous. They reappear at intervals to seek revenge until they deem their grievances settled. Unless the spirit chooses to leave on its own, it's nearly impossible to remove them without risk to human life. These spirits exhibit a notable pattern. They strike with precision based on cycles of life expectancy. I assured the woman that I would try my best to help, though I couldn't guarantee success. After leaving the house, I went to the local marketplace to look for tools that might be useful. On my way, I deliberately passed by the memorial marker near the well and examined its inscription. It wasn't an ancient relic, but a monument erected in the 1980s to commemorate the well as a local historical site. Interestingly, the marker had been placed there by the woman's farming family. A key detail struck me: the old wooden crank for drawing water from the well. The wood, worn smooth and darkened from years of use, seemed untouched by time. The crank, along with the nearby elm tree and the well itself, had likely been silent witnesses to the sixth wife's tragic death. As I shopped for supplies at the market, my thoughts returned to the elderly woman's story. I couldn't help but feel that the young sixth wife was the greatest victim in all this. Married off to a man more than 3 times her age, she lived in an era where a woman's status depended on her ability to bear children. She was denied even that basic role, which likely drove her to desperation. Though her actions were wrong, it was the rogue who enraged me the most, leaving without a word, as though the child wasn't his responsibility. By the time I gathered everything I needed, it was late afternoon. I returned to the elderly woman's house, planning to summon the spirit later that night. Once darkness fell, I chose the well as the focal point. Using its location, I marked 6 points on the ground around it, driving nails into each spot and wrapping red strings around them. I connected the points with soil from a graveyard to keep animals and insects away. No use dealing with barking dogs all night. But this setup wouldn't restrain the spirit itself. Next, I removed the wooden cover from the well and inscribed a rune on it with red ink. As the night grew silent, I stood by the elm tree and slowly lowered a red string tied to a shoe belonging to the farmer's son into the well. I warned the family to stay silent no matter what they saw, and to go back inside if they became too frightened. When the string touched the water, I felt a faint tug, much like a fish nibbling on bait. The tension quickly faded, leaving only silence. My heart raced. I'd encountered vengeful spirits before. They were among the most difficult to deal with, not only because of their violent methods, but also because of the intense resentment that fueled them, making them almost immovable. When nothing happened for several minutes, I decided to pull up the string to check. If the plain red string didn't work, I would have to resort to one soaked in blood. Of course, I meant my blood. But when I pulled out the red cord, I saw a small oilcloth wrapped object stuffed inside the farmer's shoe. It was placed there by the ghost. Considering the intense resentment tied to such souls, even if the ghost had refrained from harm due to the protection around the well, it was extraordinary to witness such calmness. I'm not a ghost, so I can only guess at their thoughts. My theory was that this woman might still cling to a shred of consciousness from her human life, hoping that whatever she wanted to bring to the well could finally see the light of day. I carefully replaced the wooden cover over the well and tied the red cord securely around the trunk of a nearby oak tree. Striking my lighter, I examined the oilcloth bundle. It was damp with moss and boar indentations, likely from being wedged into the crevice of the well wall before the woman's death. When I opened it, I found a pink embroidered pouch. Inside was a handkerchief with a pair of lovebirds stitched into one corner, covered in ink-written letters. The text, written in classical Chinese, was difficult for me to understand, so I brought it to Mrs. Brown, a well-educated elder who might decipher its meaning. After examining it, Mrs. Brown told me it was a farewell letter the woman had written to an unfaithful man. The gist of it was, I sacrificed so much for you, endured endless humiliation, and even lost the child in my womb. I dreamed of escaping with you, believing you would take me away from this misery. Yet you abandoned me without a word, leaving me to suffer alone. Hearing Mrs. Brown recite the words in her trembling voice stirred something indescribable within me. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Could it really be Lucy?" She insisted on approaching the well to confirm, but I stopped her. I explained that the ghost's resentment was too strong and approaching it could be dangerous. Undeterred, Mrs. Brown said she wasn't afraid. She needed to speak to Lucy, who had been ostracized in life but had shown her great kindness. Unable to dissuade her, I agreed. I tied the red cord around her wrist, securing the other end to the oak tree, and held the wooden cover at the ready, prepared to close it if anything went awry. Mrs. Brown, frail and trembling, knelt by the well, weeping bitterly and speaking incoherently. Her words, however, seemed sincere, filled with apologies for her family's wrongs. Her cries echoed eerily in the well, blending with what sounded like a young woman sobbing. The unsettling resonance kept me on high alert, ready to act should the situation turn dangerous. But suddenly, the ghostly sobbing stopped, leaving only Mrs. Brown's voice. She looked up, startled, and said someone had kissed her forehead. Though confused, her words reminded me of an extremely rare phenomenon among vengeful spirits. When they choose to forgive, they often express it in their own way. Could this be her way? Had the ghost finally let go? In disbelief, I lowered the wooden cover again. Testing with a fresh red cord confirmed that the ghost had indeed departed. It seemed Mrs. Brown's heartfelt apology had awakened something within Lucy, dissolving her 66 years of resentment. It was unfathomable, this energy fueled by hatred for so long. Whether for the living or the dead, such a burden must have been excruciating. Some people need a wake-up call to truly see the path they've walked. When we look in the mirror and ask ourselves whether we've grown, we may reflect on our missteps with regret. Why didn't someone stop me back then? Lucy, who lived only 22 years, harbored bitterness for 66. Was she frightening, or was it the betrayal and neglect of those around her that led to her tragic end? Once I was certain the ghost was gone, I handed the oilcloth and handkerchief to Mrs. Brown and her daughter-in-law with 3 requests. Remove the pulley from the well to sever the 66-year bond. Dismantle the wooden arch, which symbolized her humiliation. Locate the descendants of the unfaithful man and have them kneel at Lucy's grave to atone for their ancestors' sins. The daughter-in-law, wide-eyed with shock, agreed immediately. I asked her to take care of the farmer and ensure his recovery. Though I refused payment, I did request a ride down the mountain that night, as staying there any longer made me deeply uneasy. She arranged for a relative to take me down in a three-wheeled motorcycle. After spending the night in a nearby town, I continued my journey. If you enjoyed my video, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.